just from that first section, I think there's a lot to talk about. When you were talking about the product of genocide recognition to be like a shift in public policy from, I guess, the perpetrator state or any state involved, I think that what's interesting with the recognition of the Circassian genocide this year is we saw what some people might call a minor shift in policy from the Russian state, which is they, for years, had a way of silence and denial when dealing with the Circassian issue, not recognizing the people as a whole in general, basically took care of the problem. But right around the time when the recognition, when murmurs of the recognition was happening, when we knew it was going to happen in May, from Georgia, yes. The Kremlin actually decided to finally meet with an actual delegation of Circassians. These were, of course, hand-picked, cherry-picked from the diaspora to be people that are, you know, supportive of, I guess, you know, Russo policy. But still, for them to change that way and to invite a delegation to come, I thought was a bit of a shift in policy, as well as the Circassians are known inside the Caucasus to be separated by different ethnicities, whether it be Adygayans, Cherkess, or Kabardians. When the national census came around, a group, an academic group in Moscow actually had a study put out, and they finally admitted that these groups are the same. And so this once again was a shift in policy, I thought. Do you have any comment towards that?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's no part. I mean, this is exactly what you want. So if you know, if what the rationale behind your work is to get, I mean, I think that I'm going to put it like this. So that, for instance, let's be imaginative, and so in 10 years. The Russian government in Moscow, that's, you know, democratic in 10 years, says to the Circassian leaders, okay, here are the boundaries, this is your autonomy, you know, it's a confederal structure, or whatever they do, but we're not going to use the word genocide. So we're going to give all of these things to you without, you know, recognizing that what happened in 1864 constitutes genocide. Would you stop your initiative? Because, I mean, on the one hand, you know, there's this notion that you're putting this initiative in place to affect certain change within the community itself, but also, very importantly, for Moscow. And, you know, the hope is that you'll get these shifts, and those are excellent, you know, and positive shifts. But, you know, is the recognition of the event under particular terms, is that equally important? Yeah. So, now, with respect to the shifts, I mean, I can sort of, you know, tell you a bit about some of the comparative cases. I mean, the Turkish government comes to mind because there's a bit of, I mean, it has invested equally in sort of countering Armenian claims the way that the Russians do, with an important difference is that the Russians control every aspect of Circassian life, and the Turks have deported Armenians, and so the question was for most part closed. And for a long time, you know, the fact that there was not much going on did not mean that once these claims were being put forth, you know, that the Turkish government did not actually, you know, commit certain resources. And we're now at a point where they're actually in conversation with both Yerevan and the diaspora on these issues. So, yes, I mean, those are important shifts in stance. I mean, the very fact, you know, everything they do to counter this suggests that there is power in the demand. And so, you know, no press is bad press. I mean, everything, you know, whatever they say means that they're thinking about it, committing resources, and you know, and they feel threatened by it. So that in that respect, I think that, you know, there is definitely, you know, a recognition on their part that something is not right. But what's the ultimate goal of your initiative? I think, you know, it remains something to, you know, for you sort of to decide. But, you know, if you get to the point where you get all your demands met, then, you know, there is definitely power in doing this.
I think also what's interesting, just to note what you just said, just thinking back to the Ukrainian case and how once they started setting up the evidence towards the famine, how the Soviet power was trying to refute that by building, academic circles, institutions. And that same situation is happening right now in Moscow, which I find very interesting because with the run-up to the Olympics, I mean, for Moscow to have any sort of problem in the Sochi area and for it to come out that actually a genocide happened there is just going to be complete PR disaster for them, especially following the Moscow Olympics, which was completely unsuccessful for them. What we found is that in this year, an institute was given $3 million from the Kremlin to begin research to counteract the research done by the Georgians from the Tbilisi archives. Yes, so they're using the Moscow archives to counteract the Tbilisi archives, which is funny because the Tbilisi and Moscow are very similar. They were, first went to Tbilisi, then up to St. Petersburg. So if you could just comment a little bit on how when Moscow decided to counteract the Ukrainian case, how that gave them much more legitimacy and proved that, the famine actually did happen.
Sure. Well, I mean, for a very long time, the question of the Ukrainian famine is an interesting one because it's not only that the Soviet authorities at the time and the Russian authorities today have denied that what happened in 1932, 1933 constitutes genocide, they've simply denied that it took place. So for much of the Soviet period, the question of the famine was the one that it never happened. And then it took some time, and it didn't help that some of the people who were actually sort of lobbying for this were sort of right-wing or Ukrainian diaspora, and there was a lot of politics that went into this. This sort of did not help the Ukrainian case. But as more was known, and particularly as the research of the non-Ukrainian historians was something that was contributing to sort of just simply establishing the fact that famine did take place. The commission I mentioned that convened in 1919 consisted of prominent world jurists, established without doubt that what happened in 1932, 1933 was a famine. It was widespread. It wasn't concentrated on Ukraine, but it affected Ukraine the most, and Kuban and other parts of the Soviet Union. So that was the first challenge that I've encountered. And of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, it became, at least initially, easier to do that because the archives were finally open. So that the archives in Moscow were accessible, the archives in Kiev too became much more accessible. And then interestingly, of course, as you mentioned, that as the more was being dug into these archives, and the more Ukrainians were putting pressure on Moscow to recognize this, Moscow simply tried to find ways to silence this. And one of the ways that they could do that was to control the access to the archives in Moscow, not so much to those in Ukraine. So that today the issue is simply it has been propelled into international attention, and so you have initiatives that deal now with pretty much any aspect of famine genocide, and so it has been quite successful now. There is still disagreement among even some of the scholars as to whether it constitutes genocide, but essentially the notion that it was recognized, that it took place, that it cost, I don't know the estimates, I can't think of them, but it cost Ukrainians millions of lives. And I think important to your case too is the notion that the argument that has been made by the Ukrainians is somewhat similar to the Circassian argument. It's not only that this happened in 1932 and 1933, and that for many Ukrainians this was, if it was not an intention, then it was certainly something that the Soviet authorities and very much pro-Russian forces used to crush the Ukrainian nationalist movement and sort of Ukrainian nationalism. It's not only that it happened in the 1930s, but they sort of link it up to this process that they've called the Ukrainianization of Ukraine. It's, Ukraine without Ukrainians, which, for you it's Circassians without Circassia. So that the policies that have taken place, the policies of destruction, in 1932 through starvation, which is the argument that that's famine genocide, but that these policies have continued in a different shape and form through much of the Soviet period, and more importantly, the argument that they're making is that these policies have continued even under the conditions of an independent Ukrainian state, because the Russian authorities have been able to monopolize on the fact that Ukraine is a state that has a very significant Russian and Russian-speaking minority. And so some of the arguments that are being put forth is the fact that there are so many Russian speakers in Ukraine is in fact a consequence of genocide and this process of de-Ukrainianization that continue to this day because of the geopolitical context and the power that Moscow wields over Ukraine. So there is that element of the continued effect of an injustice that took place in the 1930s.
I thought it was interesting, actually, while reading your paper. I noticed that you had said that post-famine and prior to Ukrainian independence, the Ukrainians in the 20th century were almost facing a near destruction. And I find that, and you kind of noted on this just a minute ago, the similarities between the Ukrainian case and the Circassian case are striking. In regard to the genocide itself, with millions dying, the fact that there was a constant annihilation of like the intelligentsia of Ukraine. You see the same thing happening in Circassia today. Just in December of last year, Aslan Sapina, who was well known to carry on the idea of nationalism and of culture and of history, was murdered in cold blood. There's also the cultural aspect, the cultural genocide that continues against the Circassians, whether it be the language destruction and the falsification of history within the Caucasus. But what I thought was very interesting is that in 2006, the Ukraine adopted the Bill of Genocide. And what's interesting, and a lot of people don't realize this, is that in the early 90s, the Edygea Republic and Kabardino-Balkaria Republic both adopted genocide bills as well and submitted it to the Kremlin with no response, of course. And so the fact that in the 80s you saw Ukraine kind of building this momentum up, surrounded by the idea of the famine and the genocide, and this kind of led to their independence. Could you just possibly comment on that a little bit as to maybe the similarity you might be seeing today with the Circassian case? The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that the Circassian position is in some ways stronger, and then on the other hand, it's weaker. And by stronger, I mean the fact that I would imagine that for most scholars who are tasked with, say, answering the question, was 1864 a genocide, and was the famine a genocide? I think that for most scholars, a resounding yes would probably be something that pertains to the Circassian case. Deciding on the question of the famine, whether it constitutes genocide, I think is going to continue to generate a lot of debate. And the question is that, again, is it really important to some Ukrainians? It is important to recognize it as genocide or not. But I think that, just determining that fact is very difficult, and perhaps that therefore the position of the Circassian is much stronger in the sense that, well, what transpired in the 19th century much more fits the definition of genocide, both the one in the convention, but also sort of the more loosely used definitions used by Lemkin and some of the other scholars. So in that respect, I think the Circassian case may be stronger. Another thing is that I think that the Georgian archives, from what I hear, seem to be something that the Ukrainians perhaps would lack, not only because the archives are closed in Moscow, but also simply because anything that goes back to Soviet times is probably much more difficult to ascertain than the archives that have remained after the Russian army. So in that respect, I think the Circassian case is a bit stronger. On the other hand, the fact that Ukraine is an independent state means that they have more resources, and not just financial resources, but I mean, just think of the fact that, you know, the kinds of things that they're able to do by being a member state of the United Nations and to invoke all sorts of things. Now, the fact that they are has not really, I mean, they still face a lot of obstacles because simply of domestic politics of Ukraine, and, you know, who wields politics internally, and what kind of things are possible in that constellation. So that because Ukraine is an independent state, it has the state at its disposal, which is something that the Circassians don't have, and by definition are more at the mercy of Moscow. But at the same time, I think that from the perspective of evidence, and, you know, sort of just simply, you know, comparing the two cases, I mean, in my mind, I would be reluctant to say that the Femin genocide is in fact a genocide, but that, you know, the events in 1864 are much more certainly in line with the convention definition of genocide, and, you know, you could pick and choose any other ones that you want, but I mean, the convention is the important reference point here, so that in that respect, you know, that the Circassian case seems more, is stronger, but, you know, it's not a big consolation to suggest that. But again, I mean, you know, there is power in these things, in this kind of evidence. So,
to the 2014 Olympics, I think that Circassians have a very unique opportunity to use the Olympics as a platform, specifically in diaspora. We know that inside Russia, it's an increasing police state, especially now that the Olympics are coming closer, and with the human security elements that occurred prior to post 2008 war. So the diaspora has a big task ahead of it, and it needs to take the responsibility of kind of promoting this right now while it still can, while it has this platform ahead of it. And so what I was hoping is, from the cases that you've studied, whether it be the Armenian, the Bosnian, the Ukrainian especially, could you describe the diaspora's role in these cases of popularizing, you know, the said genocide, as well as their role in kind of leading up to the independence of these states, whether it be Bosnia, Ukraine, especially in regard to the recognition, if there's ever been diaspora assistance from perpetrator state recognition, and the juridical bodies you were speaking of.
I mean, the diaspora has been crucial. You know, this is exactly, you know, these are diaspora issues, and again, because of the notion that, you know, diasporas are products of genocide in most of these cases, or events, you know, that exist on this kind of continuum. So there's no question that this is a very much a diaspora issue. And I think that, I mean, if you look at the cases where there has not been an initiative, in cases where you could sort of expect it to be given the past of a particular group. I mentioned sometimes the cases of Bangladesh in 1972, its separation from Pakistan, and the genocide that transpired in 1972. You probably never hear about this. And in part, it's because the government that has ruled Bangladesh since the genocide has been the one that has been very pro-Pakistan, and therefore had no interest in pursuing the issue, but also because the very small diaspora of Bangladeshis that exists is just not very well equipped to deal with these kinds of issues, just not on their agenda. So that, you know, from the cases, both the Armenian and Ukrainian cases have started as diaspora issues, you know, with some sort of minor twists and turns, but essentially have been carried forward by the diasporas. And the interesting things, I think, is that if you look at the Armenian case, you know, there is actually, we tend to think, I think from the outside, as of these cases as sort of being, of the diasporas and the homeland as having the same agendas, and I think to a certain extent they do. But if there's one, you know, important, I think, element to take away from both of these cases, in particular the Armenian cases, that the diasporas and the homelands not necessarily have the same goals, because from the perspective of the Armenian state today, there are elements in Armenia that are very much in favor of reconciliation with Turkey, because it's just not in their interest to continue having a close border with Turkey and terrible relationships with Ankara. But the diaspora, of course, is very adamant about recognition and no relationships with Turkey in the absence of recognition. So diasporas are crucial. One thing that come to mind, I mean, when you talk about the Sochi as sort of platform, it's certainly very important. And I think that for most people who've heard about the Circassian case, the Sochi reference is a powerful platform. It's a powerful platform because you've managed to link it with something that for many people is very relevant, which is indigenous rights. And I think that if this is something that for many people in Canada in particular is a point that people can relate to. So that from the perspective of indigenous rights, it's hugely important, and therefore, from the perspective of promoting this issue is important. One of the concerns that I think sort of comes up in the discussions of, the genocide, Circassian nationalist demands, and Sochi is the possibility of terrorist attacks in Sochi. And I mean, we could play a devil's advocate and suggest that, and this is not, I'm not suggesting you pursue this strategy, but in retrospect, if you think about the Armenian case, one of the things that catapulted the issue of the Armenian genocide into world consciousness was terrorism. It was the attacks of the Asala organization on Turkish diplomats, and all of a sudden everybody in Turkey, in the public, but also everybody internationally, asking themselves, why are the Armenians killing Turkish diplomats? So that while on a certain level it took away from the cause, I mean, the notion that, well, those were terrorist attacks and a lot of innocent people died, I think that one could make an argument that this was also a strategy that for many people placed this issue in public consciousness. I think that, if there is caution to sort of, to think about is that oftentimes, these events say, your pursuit of a legitimate cause, sometimes you can't control all the points of this, and so that, events in the Caucasus that could transpire that are beyond your control could potentially take away from it. I mean, and again, this is something that you won't have control over it. I mean, I don't know what kind of agendas other groups, especially some of the more radical groups, have. But the Sochi Olympics is not something that you as a group are looking at in terms of the platform that would put your cause in the international consciousness. But I suspect that there are many other groups who would sort of look at Sochi Olympics and think, this is a great opportunity to do that. So, there's a bit of caution, I think, that you're all probably aware of. So, again, the diaspora is hugely important. I mean, instrumental in carrying this through.
Last night we, I think, touched on this a little bit, and your prior point, we touched on it a little bit, which is the question of Turkey. Mm-hmm. Obviously, in the Armenian case, it's a big deal. It's the point of contention for the Armenians is to get the perpetrator state to admit. But in the case of the Circassians, Turkey plays a very big role as well. And I would like it if you could just explain to the audience a little bit as to why Turkey is such a, yeah.
Well, I think that, looking at the Armenian case becomes an important case of a comparison in terms of sort of, learning from the case, right? Both in terms of the kinds of successful strategies that the Armenians as a group have pursued in this respect. Anything from the political recognition that they've lobbied for, and in many instances, if you go on, I think the Armenian National Institute documents the number of states, both international states and also states within the United States, for example, because the states and the provinces in Canada, pursue their own recognition, grant their own recognition. It's quite astonishing the number of states that have so far recognized the Armenian genocide. But I think more importantly, they've sort of brought it into the public eye in many states among non-Armenian audiences. But at the same time, the Armenian case is interesting to you, I think, because like the Armenians, the Circassians are up against a very powerful state that takes a denialist stance, right? And the Republic of Turkey spends millions of dollars on countering the Armenian claims. I think that they've become, and unfortunately, I mean, if the Russians are looking at Turkey, then they're learning Turkish lessons too. I haven't seen them become as nuanced in their approach as the Turks have. So this is an interesting case, and Turkey becomes important to the Circassians for two reasons. I mean, it's the home to the largest diaspora of Circassians, so that the question of Circassian genocide is in many ways a domestic issue. Or potentially could become one. Now, from the decades of sort of assimilationist pressures, it's probably not, but I mean, my understanding is that there are movements within Turkey where these issues are being discussed, the question of genocide as well. So that Turkey becomes a crucial state for two reasons, not only because it is a home to the largest Circassian diaspora, and potentially also a source of the largest repatriation movement, but also because Turkey and Russia have developed a very close relationship over the years. Now, if you think over the last 2 centuries, the Ottoman policy and then the Ottoman and then the modern Turkish policy towards Russia has been consistent in the sense that Istanbul and Ankara have always recognized Russia as a threat that needed to be balanced by allying either with the Great Britain or the United States, but in recent years, this has dramatically changed, and Turkey no longer considers Russia to be its existential threat. So the question of the kind of role that Turkey would possibly play, the one that could be of support to the Circassian, is probably under a big question mark these days. It's not only the issue that because of this growing relationship, Russia being Turkey's #1 gas supplier, recently was awarded, given the contract to build the nuclear capabilities in Turkey. The trading relationship is just growing day by day. So from that perspective, the silence that Turkey might be with respect to the Circassian genocide might be something that you're probably going to deal with. But also from the fact that, I mean, can Turkey recognize the Circassian genocide without stirring the question of the Armenian genocide? And probably not. Right? I mean, it becomes very difficult to, because they're historically very much related, and they're also related in the public consciousness of the citizens in Turkey, but also in the Caucasus. So Turkey becomes a pivotal state, but one that is very difficult to deal with given the geopolitics of the region. And so, I mean, it's quite mind-boggling. but those are the kinds of challenges that you have to deal with.
And to kind of round up our discussion, and then we'll open it up to the floor, you're an expert in genocide and to the victims and to the perpetrators and to, sort of the long-term impacts of these things. And I was just wondering if you could offer us some insight into the denial of genocide and its long-term impact on the victims, the perpetrators themselves, and then their relationship.
Well, I mean, obviously, the first, the group that's affected by this are the victims of genocide. Now, Gregory Stanton, a person who some of you know well, has developed this understanding of genocide, sort of having 8 stages of genocide. I'm not going to go through all of them, but essentially, in his model, the 8th stage, the last stage of genocide, is denial. Because it's not only enough to destroy the group or remove it from its homeland and deny its connections with the homeland, but essentially you just simply deny that it ever happened. So it's the notion of denial is very intricately linked to the actual event in place. And there's no question that if you look at the groups that have suffered genocidal violence, continue to suffer from it either because they're exiled, or because they've been reduced in number, or because there have been other pressures. They've been disempowered by this, so that the question of genocide becomes, the question of recognition becomes the one of healing and empowerment. But on the public of the state, that's the perpetrator state. And these terms are a bit difficult, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Russia in our case.
Well, Russia in your case, and certainly and in the case of the Ukrainians as well. What does denial do to its own publics? And this is a very difficult question to ascertain. But I mean, essentially, the denial of a particular state actor is in fact, it has consequences for the citizens because they sort of become implicit in something that they may not necessarily want to be implicit in. Now, this is a very, it's difficult because for most, I haven't talked to many Russians about this because I just don't have the opportunity to do that. So I don't necessarily know what their views are on, the Ukrainian claims or the Circassian claims. But with respect to, for example, Turkey, this is a very difficult question because you've had generations of people who have grown up knowing nothing about what transpired in, say, 1915 or later on. And this is not to suggest that, that people become complicit out of their volition. And I think that when it comes to the question of recognition, I think this is an important element, is that what you want to do, ideally, and I think that there is some hope with respect, if you look at the Turkish case, is that the partner in all of this is the public of that particular state. So if I look at the Armenian case, despite all the pressures that have been put on Turkey, and they have not been really that strong, because despite all the rhetoric, none of the states have really been able to push Turkey to do much. But the fact that, there's the question, sort of exists, and Turks have to counter this. But if there is one success in all of this, is the fact that in the last 5 years, or maybe 5 to 10 years, the Armenian question is something that the Turkish public is in itself discussing. So you get, people like Orhan Pamuk and Elif Shafak, the famous authors, artists, willing to violate the Turkish law to discuss this kind of issue. You get Turkish universities, Sabancı and a couple of other private universities where this becomes a question in which the public itself becomes invested in. And I think as long as you can get the public to discuss these issues and be willing to reconsider its own history, to me this seems to be the most important element. Now, given events in Russia, I would think that it's very difficult to expect, at least in the short run, anything of this sort in Russia, right? And to sort of put this into context, Turkey has come a long way from not discussing anything to holding conferences, even if they're not state-sponsored. Not only that, but the conversations go between Turkish diplomats and the Armenian diaspora and leaders in Yerevan about these issues. So, there has been movement. But again, to me, the most significant development in Turkey has been the fact that the question of Armenian deportations and the question of Armenian, Greek, whatever happened, is a question that the Turkish public is willing to consider, and in some instances of certain individuals suffer for, I think is a telling, and this is probably the most enduring change, and perhaps the most appropriate one, because again, the notion that France recognizes Armenian genocide means very little if there is nothing that happens in Turkey that would sort of open this up, because the question of genocide is the question of a group's history, and it's something that it's very difficult to deal with, and particularly in a context where the notion of openness and of revisiting and coming to terms with your own history is not the case, which is the case in Russia. This notion of reckoning with the past is just entirely foreign, and hopefully, if there is movement in the direction of greater openness and discussing these things, this is sort of the opening that would provide for building, alliances with the elements that can actually change something legitimately.
Well, with today's current climate in Russia, the election coming up, Arab Spring's effect on Russia, we can see a growing presence in Russia where many of the ethnic Russians are sort of, kind of sick of the Caucasus. They're saying, how about we just get rid of them altogether? They're really dragging us down in regards to the economy and, just the xenophobia that's present inside Moscow. So So I guess if you take the current climate and the fact that there's many academics out there today that are saying that Russia is in a very unstable state, and that if something were to happen, it would be very easy for the once again breakup of this Russian Federation to happen. And obviously the Caucasus, being on the outskirts of Russia, would be very easily to fall out. So I guess my question revolves around the pursuit of the genocide recognition by the diaspora and by Homeland, and taking the current climate into consideration as well. How do you see these two things playing out if the current climate continues and the Russians do continue with this idea of Russia without the Caucasus in regard?
Well, political scientists are generally not very good at predicting things. They haven't been able to predict a lot, so I really like to stay away from predictions.
Okay.
But no, I mean, nobody predicted the fall of the Soviet Union.
No,
And,
yeah,
exactly. So can I predict the
Anything
fall
can
of
happen,
Russia?
yeah.
Probably, but. I mean, I think that there's sort of like the worst case scenario is that scholars, and very recently there was a Foreign Affairs article which I found quite chilling in a sense that we sort of the groups like the Circassians, the Ukrainians, the people that that sort of suffer from Russian geostrategic ambition, right? Would sort of look at ways of disempowering Russia, not destabilizing it, but certainly sort of hope for moments where there will be these openings where you could, get certain things done because, well, Moscow is no longer as strong. The fear is that under existential threats, and they decide what is an existential threat to them, they can actually go completely crazy. And there's been a suggestion that they can go crazy and use the nuclear weapons and start a major war and stuff like that. And these are the sort of kind of worst case scenarios in which, well, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. The fact that if the scenario that plays out is the one where it's sort of similar to the Israeli stance, we've had enough of the Palestinians, and it's better for a two-state solution, sort of similar, well, like the Caucasus. Russia would still have an interest in a stable Caucasus. And there's also then the question, okay, so there's the power vacuum, so what happens? I mean, do you then take it for a guarantee that if Russia is out of the picture, that your political project of Circassian unity becomes a viable one? Because Russia is the most powerful actor in the scene, but it's certainly not the only one. And the kind of power competition that goes on. So then I think that sort of becomes the next question. What happens internally? And how do they explain themselves out in the context of the Caucasus politics minus Russia?
Right.
So I think that, given also the fact that, well, Turkey is next door, and it will be drawn into all of that. I think that, I mean, if there is a best case scenario, it would be an internal domestic change in Russia that sort of, that has an impact on their understanding of, what does it mean to have minority rights? I mean, the very understanding of the notion, of human rights and non-violating human rights. And so, that sort of becomes the building block of what kinds of possibilities there are with respect to the Caucasus. Russia, existential threats, it's a scary prospect. But
Least.
yes, and of course, Russia democratic reform is not perhaps a short-run thing, but you never know.
Well, on that note, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions.